I think Blender's such a great tool and it can produce such amazing stuff as well. And I'd love to see more people doing stuff in Blender and doing stuff with data and data animation as well. And if you can sort of chin the render times with it, it's definitely worth trying. I love Cinema 4D and DEM Earth as well. It's a great plugin for that. Obviously, there's a price barrier with that though.
Welcome to another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel and this is a podcast for the Geospatial community. Today I'm talking to Craig Taylor from a company called EtoWorld, and he's going to be telling us about his inspirational work with geovisualization and animation. Welcome, Craig. Thank you so much for coming along today and taking the time to do this interview with me. You're doing a lot of really interesting things. And I think one of the first things that caught my eye about your work is a project you did called Coral Cities. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that. But I think before we really dive into that conversation, maybe it'd be a good idea if we take the listeners with us and you could tell me a little bit about your background in terms of geospatial.
Yeah, sure. I mean, thank you for having me, first and foremost. This is the first podcast I've ever recorded, so it is both equally terrifying and exciting at the same time. So, I'm a newbie to this. Right, okay, well, a bit of background on me. So, I currently work for a company called EtoWorld, and I'm heading up their data visualization service team at the moment. I'll talk a little bit about what we do more specifically later. But in terms of my training and where I started, I suppose, like many GIS practitioners in the UK, I started with an undergrad in geography. I was introduced to GIS and remote sensing, and it sort of immediately clicked with me. I like the technical aspect. More importantly, I like the design aspect. I loved creating maps. I found it really interesting. And that kind of progressed on. Lancaster University, where I studied, was quite progressive in its uptake of GIS and technologies, and they started a master's program called Environmental Informatics, which basically took GIS and remote sensing and used it in a way that was applied to real world scenarios. So, for instance, where would you put a waste treatment facility in the UK, and then we would be using GIS as a sort of proxy to do that, using site sieve analysis and multi-criteria analysis. So that was really interesting. I thought that was great. That sort of cemented that idea that this is my sort of career track. And for the first, I suppose, 10 years of my career, it was pretty much working my way through various planning and engineering companies as a GIS analyst and cartographer. So like some Michelle, Barton Wilmore, Björn Happold. And it was a real mixture of GIS work. It was kind of heavy plan production stuff, which you kind of come to expect, with a bit of light analysis. And it sort of wasn't really until I worked at a company called Barton Wilmore that really started using GIS a little bit more to its max, taking me back to the university days. We worked on behalf of a lot of house builders, and they wanted to look for sites in the UK to develop a housing block or housing development site. And we'd use multi-criteria analysis to figure out where to put that. So we would take in loads of different environmental constraint factors, planning factors, and we would sort of overlay them all on top of each other and use different weightings and criteria analysis to figure out where best to put something. So that was great. It was using sort of GIS to where I wanted to use, to how I wanted to use it. And then I kind of segued a little bit into, we used to sort of produce lightweight web maps using Mapbox.gl for these clients, so they could sort of interactively explore all the data, which was great. And it kind of around this time, I sort of wanted to transition a little bit more into the design side of things. I always loved 3D. I always loved the design side of GIS and the cartography. And back in the days when you kind of using ArcScene, which was great for what it was, but I always found like there was a massive constraint in terms of the aesthetic quality that I was producing. So I remember seeing this guy, his name's, I think it's Louis Dilger, his work on Behance on city layouts. And he was using Cinema 4D and rendering these absolutely incredible city layouts in it was either Arnold or Octane. And that then became my goal. I wanted to produce something that was as good as that. That was the best thing I'd seen in terms of 3D geospatial. And I was like, right, that's my pinnacle. When I get there, started learning a lot of Blender. So Blender's a really great open source 3D package, and using their cycles renderer to sort of achieve that real world lighting that Louis had in his city layouts and I was nearly getting there. And Blender has some really good GIS interpolation tools, so you could bring in, built form road networks and start extruding them, sort of creating these flat city layouts. But then I sort of got hooked up on not being able to use topography. So I could never really drape these buildings on top of topography. So, like, for instance, if you were doing a map of San Francisco, you'd want that undulating topography. And I could never get that until I sort of went into the Cinema 4D world. And there's an amazing plugin from a guy called Paul Everett called DEM Earth, which basically allowed you to do that. So that then became my GIS tool of choice for producing these sort of 3D layouts. And then that sort of natural progression into animation. I was sort of got bored of just doing static plans of just, this is the environment, this is the terrain. I wanted to bring data in, and, whether that data was just house price data for the UK's extruded polygons, or visualizing vehicle flow along a sort of route network. That then became my goal. And around this time, I saw it was actually kind of weird. Before I even knew about Ito World, they won a competition with the AGI to create this visualization of people flow in London over New Year's Eve, and they used telephony data to do that. And it was just amazing. It was this beautiful organic visualization of people movement as these little hexagons that sort of extruding and migrating over time. And I just thought, wow, that is the most effective data visualization for geospatial data that I've ever seen. And it was one of them things where you just watch it on loop and it was like, this is brilliant. And then that became my goal. So, trying to hack Cinema 4D to do these kind of visualizations was really difficult, because it's great with geometry, but it doesn't. Well, I always found it wasn't really great for linking raw data to it. So, trying with these different. So my Twitter feed was full of these really crappy, sort of very, very generic animations. And one thing led to another. I got talking to Ito World, and that's where I am today, sort of heading up their data visualization services, using their software to create all these weird and wonderful geospatial visualizations. And that's kind of it in a nutshell, really. Sorry, I went on a little bit then.
That's not a problem at all. It was interesting. Hey, you did say a lot there, though, and that's fair enough, because it's been a long journey for you. But what I got out of it was that you started off as this sort of classically trained geographer, if you will, at doing GIS, and you moved into planning. But you could see the light. You could see something else over there that you aspired to be, at you really wanted to be able to do an experiment with, and you did it. That in itself, I think, is really inspirational. But I think it highlights this idea that the GIS guy or girl sitting out in an organization is doing a whole bunch of different things. And they seem to be expected to be specialists in so many different fields, where you were really interested in the visualization side of things. And you took it a step further, because you took that visualization out of GIS, or at least those the classic pieces of software that I think most people listening to this podcast are used to using or hearing about anyway, and you took it over to something completely different that was specially designed for those kinds of visualizations. So I think that's a really interesting progression, and I think we're probably going to see that role of the GIS guy or girl out at the organization being split up more and more and more, and not being expected to be able to do everything with the server and the database and the web map and create visualizations as well as run analysis.
Well, yeah, I think it's important for people to feel like they shouldn't be constrained by a piece of software, and that you shouldn't necessarily need to use open source. You shouldn't need to use a certain proprietary software. You should just do something that you feel is comfortable for you and can do what you want to do. So I found that the softwares I was using weren't producing stuff that looked like I wanted to. So I found a piece of software that did, and just learned that. And I think that's really important to not feel that you should ever be capped by software. That's just ridiculous. You should always kind of aspire to do something more than that.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about there is choosing the best tool for the job to complete the goal. And some things that I find, or a thing that I find myself repeating on this podcast, is that I personally was in the situation where I had fallen in love with the medium as opposed to the mission. If the mission was to create the best geo visualizations possible, do what you did, find the right tool for the job and go over there. instead of being religious about, I am open source, I am Esri, I am whatever else, I only program in Python or R. So I really, really like that approach. And I hope that that inspires other people when they listen to this to go and find the best tool that allows them to do the best work possible.
Yeah, and it's also, you'll never find one piece of software that does everything you need to do. Like, for instance, I loved cinema and I loved doing stuff in there, but it was rubbish at database management, and there was no audit trail to my data sets. Basically everything. And still now we have we have bespoke software in EtoWorld that does a certain amount of stuff, but you still need the GIS softwares to underpin a lot of the spatial analysis we do. So I think it's important to, you know, be able to use as many different software, not be able to use as many different softwares as possible, because you almost get put in that thing of, well, I can use loads of different softwares, but I'm not a master of any. I just think it's important to, be able to use the softwares that you need to do a specific job.
Yeah, it does. At the very start of this interview, I talked about something called coral cities. Can you explain a little bit about what you've done there?
Part of my role at EtoWorld, well, my role at EtoWorld is to produce visualizations for our clients, quite high-end cinematic visualizations, depicting data in new and interesting ways. That's the sort of service sector that I run, and we produce all sorts of different visualizations for clients, like Hyperloop, telematics companies, and likes of TomTom, DFT. There's another sort of aspect of my role, which is to kind of find new and interesting ways to visualize data as well, and produce concept pieces that kind of take what could be considered quite a generic sort of data set, and turn it into something that looks a little bit more interesting. And that's kind of where Coral Cities came alive a little bit. So we were working on a project for the Department for Transport where we were looking for innovative ways to show drive time catchments. Now, a lot of the work I do is in the 3D realm. So, we're always looking to try and pop data out of the screen along a sort of Z axis. And we were looking at these drive time catchments, and they were, your generic polygon areas, and they were quite flat on the screen. And we just thought, it's not really dynamic. It's not popping out. It doesn't look incredible in 3D. Probably, if we're going to just do that, there's no point using 3D. So what we started to do was expose that underlying road network. So we would figure out the road network that was within a certain catchment area, and then we would start doing stuff to extrude these road networks. So we'd create like these mini fences, which kind of had this 3D vibe to it, but still was quite flat. And then I had an idea to basically, for each vertice on that road network, to extrude it proportional to the height from the center of the city. So, for instance, the closer you'd be to the center of the city, the higher up that point would be. And that sort of created these really weird drive time mountains, is what we called them. And then we were sort of playing around internally, and my CTO, Hal Bertram, was sort of like, oh, yeah, but what happens if we invert these? And we inverted it, and we created this coral type formation. And we were like, oh, wow, this is amazing. And then that kind of project took a life of its own, really. We did a sort of a quick concept piece for the EU cities release livability index, and we visualized the top 10 livable cities as coral cities, and that got a little bit of traction on social media, and we thought, well, okay, this is a really cool project. I just kind of took it from there, really, and we produced over 100 of these coral cities through the space of kind of 6 months. We packaged them up as posters and these little animations, and we submitted them to the Information is Beautiful Awards. And yeah, it was a great project to sort of visualize, like I said, quite a generic data set, but just turn it into something that was far more engaging and far more beautiful than what it was in its current form.
And I think you raise a really interesting point there. And like, data can just be beautiful. It can just be amazing, and that has some value in itself. I think, we're not always trying to visualize a whole screed of numbers, or try and put a whole bunch of text in there. Sometimes it's enough just to make people stop. Give us your attention just for 2 seconds. Look at this, and maybe that'll lead on to something else if they're really interested in how it was made, or what the story is you're trying to tell there. But I really like that sometimes it's just enough to make something that's beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really fine line between. So the concept pieces are great. They can. I'm not really bothered if they're too insightful or not. They're just fun little visualization things. But for our clients, for instance, there always has to be insight. So it has to. We sort of pride ourselves on each visualization has engagement. It has insight, and it must have a narrative to it as well. So we can create stuff that looks really nice and get people engaged. That's great, but we also think of ourselves fundamentally as interpreters of data. So we like to, create animations that grab an audience's attention, but we also understand the importance of insight. So with our software, we ingest huge volumes of data. We can derive insight over a temporal scale. And also we like to think of ourselves as storytellers, right? So every visualization we produce is kind of like a user-guided experience for a data set they may or may not be familiar with. By the hope at the end of that visualization, they understand the sort of the narrative and the insight that we're telling them. So creating stuff that's beautiful is important because that gets initial engagement, but it has to have a story. It has to be insightful. And I hold my hands up, and some of the visualizations that I produce have been, I think they look quite good, but I don't have much insight at all. And quite recently, I sort of felt the brunt of that with. I found an amazing data set for basketball shot trajectories. Well, it wasn't shot trajectories. It was just the NCAA released this huge data set back to 2013 that showed where every single point was scored or missed from a basketball shot. And I had this idea to create a kind of buzzer beater visualization. So visualizing all the shots that were made and not made in the last sort of seconds of the game. And I kind of thought it looked cool. It was this sort of arc-based trajectory thing with all these spheres going into the hoops, and it was kind of, it's a super busy, really quick visualization. It was only like 10 seconds long, and I sort of thought I had some, I put a previous one on Reddit, and it got a few upvotes. So I was like, oh, okay, I'll put this one on Reddit, and it quickly dawned on me that people, they don't just like stuff that's beautiful. There needs to be insight. And there were so many comments about, yeah, but this looks great, but what's it showing? It's too busy. There's you shouldn't be showing two sides of the court. And all these comments, which was valid feedback, but it's difficult to get that sort of fine line right. And you just wanted to respond saying, this is just a bit of fun, but yeah, obviously it's difficult to find that balance. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Just like before, we were talking about find the right tool for the job, and there's different tools for different jobs. There's different visualizations for different kinds of impacts that you're trying to have. If you're trying to tell a story, perhaps it's a good idea to have some more context around that. If we could stay with that example for a little bit, how would you put context around that? Would you do the 7 classic things that we were taught to do with a map back in the day at university? Would you put the title and the key and the whatever else on it, or what other kinds of things could you do to put that context into the visualization itself without having to link someone off somewhere else to read about it?
Yeah, so 3D animation is in my opinion, it's quite a bit different from your sort of generic cartography and map production. And there was a really lovely tweet from super talented cartographer Sarah Bell, who kind of tweeted about improvising from the riffs and not being constrained by the fundamentals of cartography and experimenting and sort of evolving, and that sort of chimed so true for me. I mean, my ethos in design is to always constantly try and create something different, to try and evolve your visualization style, and not be, the fundamentals of cartography are really important, and they underpin a lot of our visualizations, but I don't think you should be constrained by them, and they shouldn't be this chain that holds you back. And sort of going on to having legends and having titles and all the sort of the standard kind of generic cartography stuff. Sometimes it just doesn't apply for animation. Animation it kind of is like a visual tour, and we're producing a visualization at the moment for TomTom, and one of the things was, well, do we put a legend on, or do we just have a quick explanation of what the data is at the beginning, and then once a user reads that, then they can then understand what's happening. And the sort of the standard cartography principles just sometimes are not needed in 3D animation, and I think I think that's important, and I think you kind of need to, as I say, an experiment, and sometimes through them experiments you'll fail, but it's only when you fail that you realize, okay, well, maybe we did need a legend that's stuck through your whole thing, or maybe we did need an explanation text, or maybe we did need this, that, and the other, or there was some more context that was needed because this data on its own didn't make sense unless it was put in, context of other data sets as well. So it completely varies from project to project.
But I guess that doesn't really surprise me that you fail sometimes and you get feedback and you do it again. And that's, in the software world, if you were building something, it'd be pretty normal to come out with a prototype, have it fail, get some feedback, make some changes, go out again, fail again, get more feedback, and that sort of iterative process of improving things before it gets to the end user. And it feels like that's what you're talking about here in terms of visualization.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of our projects we produce for our clients, we go through multiple stages of iteration. We'll sort of storyboard. A lot of the clients that we work with have never worked with animation before, so they don't really know how to put into words what they want to show, and they don't really know what their narrative is. So we try and storyboard frame by frame, or as frame by frame as you can get each stage of that visualization. But there'll be points in that iteration process where the client will go, okay, well, now I see it visualized and now I see my data visualized. It doesn't really work like that. Or now I see my data visualized, it's actually telling me a different pattern because we've never seen it visualized that before. And so you have these sort of quite important or very important feedback loops with clients where you kind of iterate and change things on the fly. And it's really important to not get held down by a visualization style. And on our recent project, I had this amazing idea that I was going to show this visualization style of vehicle flow, but I kind of wanted to show these hourly blocks, and it was sort of like this quite conceptual point cloud, and I showed it to the client, and they were like, "Oh, this looks amazing," but it's too complicated for our audience. And again, like spent a fair bit of work producing this, but it was that failure that made me realize, okay, right, let's go back to the drawing board. Let's make a more clearer, more not as conceptual visualization, and that worked. The client loved it, and it was successful. But even when you're on, it's not just the small concept pieces where you'll throw out on Twitter and someone will go, that's rubbish. It's the big projects that we have with our clients where we go through these several stages of iteration where sometimes you just don't hit it right first time, and you just kind of have to be able to, as a designer, have to be able to take criticism and take that feedback and sort of adapt and evolve through it. And so failure is very, very important for what we do because it makes us better designers, it makes us better analysts, and yeah, it's vital in our sort of design process.
You mentioned the word designer there quite a number of times. Do you see yourself as a cartographer or a graphic designer or an animator? I mean, you're still working with geographic data. Well, how do you see yourself?
No, don't really know. Well, like I said, GIS and spatial analytics underpins all of our visualizations. So that training of being able to analyze data sets spatially is vital. But I also have this passion as a designer, and with design comes animation, and that's another thing in itself of another sector which I'm sort of fairly new to, and that's a big learning curve. But I love the design side of stuff. I love making stuff look interesting and beautiful. And I suppose I would never class myself as a designer, but I'm sort of more as a spatial designer than anything else. I suppose I don't know.
Yeah, and again, I wasn't trying to trap you there or trick you into hopping into one box or another. I just think it's interesting. I think
Yeah,
that yeah,
get off the fence.
but I think that's really interesting because oftentimes I'll say I'm a GIS consultant, but I also work with databases and I do this and I do this and I make maps sometimes and I also look at web maps and debug them and fix the problems that are between them and the database and all these other things. But that all comes under the heading of GIS. And like what I said earlier, in my mind at least, that's been broken up, or at least there's becoming more and more room in the industry. If you want to go more down the design route, then people recognize that that gives value now. And if you're good at that, then we're prepared to pay
Yeah.
for that. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Mm.
Which brings me on to my next question now. So you've had this great journey. You've started from that sort of classic training in university with GIS, and you've moved through the planning stage of your career, and now you're into this really sort of experimental design stage where you're playing with a lot of different visualizations and working with companies and trying to do things in a new way. When you look out at the market now, when you look out at the industry, maybe not as a whole, but your piece of it, in terms of geodata visualization, what are the really big opportunities out there at the moment?
I think I think the landscape of GIS has just changed quite a bit over the years. It's, you know, as a GIS analyst or, consultant now, you're not just required to make plans. You need to be able to, produce a web map. You need to be able to, analyze X, Y, and Z. And it's a broader spectrum, and technology as well is sort of becoming far more accessible. So, like I was saying, when I was sort of learning animation, um, I had sort of Blender and Cinema 4D to sort of use. I don't think even QGIS at the time didn't have the Time Manager, or maybe it did have the Time Manager plugin, but it was kind of quite rudimentary. But now you've got some, amazing libraries like Kepler, for instance, that you can do, amazing visualizations in 3D with. That's more accessible than it was, 5 years ago. And I think the accessibility to these tools and to the general sort of landscape as a whole is becoming far more accessible, and it's becoming broader as well. And more people are doing more stuff in animation, and more people are doing more stuff in 3D, and more people are able to use, Blender and this, that, and the other to create these incredible pieces. And it's almost like the bar is being raised and raised and raised, but more people are, being able to access it easier as well. So I think it's a really exciting time for spatial at the moment, because it's so varied. You can be a developer, you can be a website, you can work with Mapbox.gl or whatever you want to work with. You can make web maps, you can be a designer, you can work in 3D and have that spatial thing as well. And it's so much broader than it was, 10 years ago when I first started in GIS, and you were only required to produce constraint plans or whatever you did, in as a sort of consultant's role.
So after that, it feels like you have that abundance mentality, that there's room for everyone, there's plenty of opportunity, and you don't see this as a threat, as taking away that sort of gatekeeper status that some of us in the industry have had before. So you see it as inspirational, and the opportunities abound.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for our clients as well, it's quite difficult sometimes when you go into a sort of a client meeting and you're presenting geospatial animation for the first time, and they just haven't got a clue because they've never seen geospatial animation before. But now it's becoming more and more popular, and now clients are seeing more of it. It's becoming more accessible. So whereas in the past they didn't know they needed something because they didn't know they could have something, now it's like, we can see that being produced there, and there. We want that as well. So it's almost, like there's more opportunity now than there ever was, because people are more familiar with animation and sort of and sort of spatial storytelling than they were before.
So it sounds like this is a positive feedback loop that we're in. The more there is, the more demand it creates, because people see this and go, wow, that's amazing.
I hope so.
I would like to be able to visualize our data like that. I want to tell stories in this way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to think so.
So I've just got a couple more questions now before we say goodbye. I realize that they're running running short on time anyway. And one of them is, when you look out at the market now, again, I say market, what I mean to say is industry, in terms of geo visualization and animations. Can you see any trends at the moment? These things tend to move in trends. We see someone doing something amazing and we add a little bit to it, but that sort of general trend is there. Is there anything that you can see at the moment that seems to be predominant?
In animation, in spatial animation, not in terms of predominant, because I still think it's fairly new as a field. That people are still sort of trying to find new data sets and visualize it. I mean, transport, Eto World, I work for Eto World, who specialize in transit data. So we visualize movement data, and that's kind of a shoe in for animation. And there are lots of people visualizing, like GTFS feeds or real time bus feeds or train feeds or car, or, whatever it is. So that's kind of, I see a lot of that on my, inspiration feeds, which is great. But also, I kind of, I don't like to follow the trend of, okay, everybody's visualizing X or everyone's visualizing Y. I like to find new things and visualize them in different ways as well. And I think it's important to be creative and not just have a look at what someone else has produced and then try and produce it exactly the same. Iterate on that. Develop it a little bit more. And I think that process creates the more interesting visualization pieces as well.
So we talked a little bit about the tools that you use, and I don't claim to know all of them, but is there any set of tools or one or two out there that you're most excited about when you think about the future of this?
Okay, definitely. Can I not say on the fence and say all of them on this one? Do I have to go down? So I think for me, obviously we have our own internal tools that allow us to do our own set of visualizations. And, like I mentioned him before, our CTO, Hal, he's so talented in this and he's constantly creating, shaders and all sorts of different ways for me to create new visualizations. But sort of parking that in terms of the accessibility for other people as well. And I think, QGIS is doing some really amazing stuff with where it's being developed in terms of the animation stuff and its 3D capabilities as well. Obviously, Kepler is just an amazing tool set for visualizing spatial data, and that's becoming more and more accessible. There's a load of other online tools which I don't claim to know or know much about. But as well as the Blender, the world of Blenders, I think Blender's such a great tool and it can produce such amazing stuff as well. And I'd love to see more people doing stuff in Blender and doing stuff with data and data animation as well. And if you can sort of chin the render times with it, it's definitely worth trying. I love Cinema 4D and DEM Earth as well. It's a great plugin for that. Obviously, there's a price barrier with that though. Yeah, and it's not just that. It's things like Tableau as well. There's people doing stuff with Tableau, for instance, that are just absolutely amazing. And Tableau's got Mapbox integration now, and it just looks some of the visualizations that are being produced look incredible. And it's so great to see different practitioners from different parts of the visualization world doing different things with data, but it's it's almost like, oh, I want to learn Tableau now because I want to be able to do all these dashboard stuff. But it's it's great. It's a great place to be in at the moment.
I have a feeling that I already know the answer to this, but I'd like to ask it anyway as like the final question in this interview, and that is, well, where do you think this is going in the future in terms of geovisualization? Are we just going to see more of it, or do you see it going in any one particular direction?
It's difficult. So obviously, from an animation point of view, I'd love to see more accessibility to animation tools in softwares, but more, so animation is difficult in that it's not just the data that needs to be animated. You need camera movements and all sorts of stuff. And I'd love to see more softwares, using that camera movement type thing. And there's, I think, Google Studio, is it called? I think which has been released recently, is kind of bridging the gap between spatial and almost like the After Effects world as well. And that's really interesting. I think in general, we're just going to see more and more of this being accessible. I think I'd love to think people see the value in spatial storytelling through animation. And I'm going to be really positive in that this I do see this sector as growing and becoming more and more important. And I think more and more companies like the Esris and QGIS of this world are going to end up incorporating more and more tools that allow you to be able to analyze spatial data sets that have a temporal element to them as well.
Yeah, I was actually really pleased that you mentioned QGIS before in terms of one of your tools that you're excited about, because I feel like that's really accessible for people. They're probably already using it anyway if they're working in the GIS field or have at least heard of it. And it just seems like so much more accessible instead of going out and downloading Blender and starting right from scratch again.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously if you're sort of new to spatial and new to 3D, don't go straight in with Blender because it is incredibly confusing. But yeah, understand the principles and the core. Understand the core principles of cartography and being able to produce, maps in sort of industry standard softwares is great. But then, once you feel comfortable in that, I definitely encourage everyone to just explore other softwares and stick some data in Blender and see what happens. make mistakes, really, because that you end up becoming a better designer, a better analyst when you realise what the drawbacks of certain visualizations are.
Craig, I really want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. I said this at the start, at least I believe I did. I think your story is really inspirational. The work you do is beautiful. And also inspirational. And I would encourage the listeners to go out and Google coral cities and have a look at that, because it's a really interesting piece of work. Thanks again for coming along today. But before you leave us, can you tell us where we can go to learn more about you and follow along?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I definitely encourage you all to check out Ito World, because that's my company, or the company I work for, and we're doing some amazing stuff in visualization. I'm on Twitter at Craig Taylor GIS, and I'm always putting different visualization pieces and concept pieces and fun and stupid visualizations on there. I also have a website, which I haven't updated in a while, but I should do, and that's mapzilla-art.co.uk. And yeah, like I said, I'm always producing. Do you know what? For me, especially social media and having interaction with other people and other people in the industry, and producing this sort of stuff is really great. But it's the feedback that you get, and it's, it doesn't need to be positive. It can be, critical as well, and that's really important as well. And I would encourage everyone to, if you are producing, visualizations, to share them with other people. And the cartography and data visualization world is a really welcoming sector, especially on Twitter. And I'd encourage everyone to share their work, ask for critique. There's some great Slack options as well. So if you're familiar with Slack, the Data Visualization Society has a great Slack, and people put stuff all the time on there. Like there's so many different channels for so many different needs. There's a mapping channel that people put stuff on and ask for feedback all the time. But I think, for me as well, like sharing is a really important part of what I do, and getting feedback and sort of evolving. And I think being able to interact with people on Twitter is really important. So I'd encourage everyone to share more.
Thanks again, Craig. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Thanks very much for having me.
And that's it for another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel, and I'd just like to ask you for one small favor today, and that would be, if you are enjoying these podcast episodes, please share it with a friend. I would really appreciate it. I'd also like to remind you that you are more than welcome to reach out to me on social media. I would love to hear from you, and you'll find some useful links in the show notes. That's it from me. We'll talk again next week. Bye.